Hello, everyone. I'm Lisa Johnson, CEO of BioForward, talking to you from snow-covered Stoughton, Wisconsin. Well, that low pressure moved north more than they expected, so we definitely were hit in southern Wisconsin. You know, I love days like this. You have to find joy in all types of weather and circumstances, and we all need to get out of our depression after the Packers loss. I even have my Packers blanket still in the background.
I was rooting for them.
Yes, you should have been. Thank you for joining us today from all over the state of Wisconsin. For those of you who are not familiar with BioForward Wisconsin, we represent Wisconsin's robust and comprehensive biohealth cluster, where our members are addressing global health across a full spectrum, including research, medical devices, diagnostics, biotech, and our statewide supply chain, providing critical products and services to our biohealth companies. We are an action-oriented association that is focused on initiatives to strengthen Wisconsin's talent pipeline, promote our statewide capabilities through national campaigns. We work on collaborations to foster long-term partnerships, and we conduct legislative advocacy, and we welcome many of our state legislators and their offices to this event. Finally, we are focused on educating people in our industry. Wisconsin biohealth companies and research institutions have played an essential role in responding to the COVID-19 crisis, from manufacturing critical reagents for testing kits to the testing and manufacturing of therapeutics and vaccines to treat and prevent COVID-19. We recognize how exhausting this pandemic has been on all of us. We are constantly bombarded with bad news, but we can go from bad news to good news. It is emotional, but it is imperative that we all get fact-based information to make decisions going forward on how to bring an end to this pandemic, which includes being vaccinated. That is why we are holding this session with Phyllis Arthur to address some of these emotions, concerns, questions that many people have around COVID-19 vaccines. We encourage you to ask questions you may have about the COVID-19 vaccines in the chat. Some of those questions I will ask of Phyllis after her presentation. But first, please listen to Phyllis. Be courteous and respectful of her and each other. Remember, we are all in this together. I would now like to introduce Phyllis Arthur, who is Vice President of Infectious Diseases and Diagnostic Policy at the Biotechnology Innovation Organization, better known as BIO, based in Washington, D.C. Phyllis has extensive background in vaccines, having previously worked at Merck & Co. for over 16 years in their vaccine division. Phyllis's full bio is on the Eventbrite page. So with that, Phyllis, take it away, and thank you so much for joining us.
Well, Lisa, thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be here with you all today and to talk about the COVID vaccines and hopefully answer many of the most frequently asked questions that many people have as they start to get excited about the opportunity to be protected against COVID. I'm going to share my screen, and it's always an interesting exercise. Wonderful. So the title of the talk is "The Vaccine is Here, Now What?" about COVID-19 vaccines. And again, I'm Phyllis Arthur at BIO. Okay. So this is what we call our race car slide. It's a slide that shows the vaccines that are in development worldwide, a subset of those in development worldwide for COVID-19. And you'll see, obviously, that we're very excited to see a number of vaccines either out on the market to be used or just about to go through the FDA approval process. And I'll talk about these a little more in detail. I'll note that we just turned red the Merck vaccines. Yesterday, Merck announced that they did not see the kind of efficacy results they wanted to see for the 2 vaccines they had in development for COVID, and were therefore ending those programs. But you still see a host of vaccines very near to getting the FDA approval or authorization. So we hope that many of these other vaccines will come to us soon. I just want to talk a little bit about the pledge that industry has made at the highest levels to make sure that they uphold the scientific rigor that we always apply when making vaccines or any other medicine. So I just call your attention to the pledge that was made last year in September by 9 vaccine company CEOs who pledged to uphold the scientific and ethical standards of the FDA, to do things absolutely according to the best ethical rules, and to make sure safety and well-being and quality were maintained in all of the clinical work they were doing. These vaccine companies actually have a long history of making very important vaccines that we all receive, or our children receive, and adolescents every single day. So I wanted to just showcase the pledge to you, and you can certainly go find it on many websites. So let's talk about the two vaccines that have been authorized by the FDA. So first is the Pfizer BioNTech vaccine. This vaccine is 2 injections. They're given about 3 weeks apart. The product is authorized for those 16 years of age or older. Their big phase 3 trial, that is the very large trial you do to make sure that it works, to check for important safety information, that trial had 44,000 people in the United States. You see the breakdown in racial and ethnic groups. They worked very hard to try to have broad representation by race, gender, and age. So 10% African American, 26% Latino or Latina, and then 25% of the people in the study were over 65 years old. What we saw was very important, excellent efficacy for the vaccine, 95% effective in preventing illness caused by COVID-19. And they have a very specific way of looking at illness. You had to have a positive test. You had to have some symptoms for COVID-19, not necessarily be very sick, but have the cough or one of the early symptoms. What they saw, very importantly, was there was no differences in this efficacy number of 95% for people who were over 65 or people who were young, no differences by race or ethnicity or gender, and as importantly, no differences in efficacy even if you had an underlying condition like diabetes or lung disease. The side effect profile, relatively straightforward, similar to what you might see if you've gotten the shingles vaccine in its 2 shots. Pain in the arms, swelling, redness. People had chills and tiredness, headaches, and some people did complain of joint pain. Generally, these side effects resolve within 1 to 3 days post-vaccine, but some people may have arm pain or joint pain that mean they have to take a day off of work. The side effects listed here are more common after the 2nd dose. And I think many of you, again, that had 2 shots of shingles may find you had the same experience. In addition, the other product that was authorized also in December was the product from Moderna. Again, 2 shots, 28 days apart. That's 4 weeks apart in people 18 years of age or older. Their last big phase 3 trial was 30,000 people. This is the number that's required at a minimum by the FDA. So companies have to at least have 30,000 people in their phase 3 trial. Again, very similar work to try to make sure that the people in the study were all different races, ages, and different underlying conditions. So you see the breakout of race and ethnicity was about the same as Pfizer. 25% of the people in the Moderna trial were healthcare workers. 25% were over 65. And 22% had at least one underlying condition, with 4% having 2 or more. The efficacy for the vaccine was 94%, again in preventing illness caused by COVID-19, measured very similarly to what we did with Pfizer, that is a positive test and at least 1 early symptom at least. Again, no differences were seen based on age, race, ethnicity, or gender, or underlying conditions, and they had a broad array of people with various conditions. The side effect profile, very similar to Pfizer's product: pain, swelling, redness, chills, a headache, generally resolving around the same amount of time, and definitely side effects more common after the 2nd dose. So it's important to understand these vaccines and how they work. They're messenger RNA vaccines, or mRNA vaccines, what you'll hear in the press. It's a new type of technology used for developing vaccines, but please understand that this technology has been used in clinical trials for other vaccines, and then COVID jumped ahead of these vaccines that were being researched for licensure. So COVID is the first product out with use of this technology, but there are many thousands of people who've been in clinical trials for this technology for vaccines against flu, as well as the other 2 coronavirus vaccines we've seen in the past, MERS and SARS. So COVID's the first approval or authorization we have, but there is more clinical data than just the COVID data. The messenger RNA, really think of it as delivering the instructions to your cells for teaching them how to make a specific set of proteins that build antibodies. This is what leads to your immune response. It's important to understand that these vaccines do not include the DNA for the virus. They actually don't include the virus at all. So you're not getting infected with COVID-19. In addition, it's important to understand that these vaccines do not interact, the messenger RNA doesn't interact with your own DNA. Actually, the messenger RNA goes into your cell, but it never enters the nucleus or center of your cell. And actually, once it delivers the instructions for making the proteins and the antibodies, your body eliminates it very rapidly. So really what it's doing is building what I call a set of soldiers or warriors, these antibodies that are there to help you eliminate the virus should it show up and try to give you an infection or make you seriously ill. But it doesn't actually interact with your own DNA, and it doesn't contain any DNA. So the speed of the COVID vaccine is one of the questions that many people ask. And I just wanted to spend a minute talking about how industry was able to go quickly in developing the vaccine without actually sacrificing the very rigorous tools we use to make sure we look at safety and efficacy and quality. So again, remember the clinical trials were actually quite large, 30 to over 40,000 people. And that's actually bigger than we normally would do for phase 3 trials. So a lot of people tested, and there no one actually sacrificed the trial size to make sure we have good data. The ways that we actually moved more quickly to make the vaccine available actually are, think of them as if you were building a house and you applied more resources to it. So first of all, we actually had the existing foundation of the technology of mRNA. And several of the other vaccines that will be coming out early this year, similarly, are based on foundations that actually you allowed to go faster in development. You still have to do all the clinical tests, but you don't have that multiple year-long time when you're trying to come up with a vaccine to test in people. You can do that much more quickly. So the foundation was already there for making these vaccines. The new technologies actually allow you to go faster because you don't have to grow the virus, for example. You can actually use different kinds of technology to actually very quickly have a vaccine that looks like the virus, but doesn't contain any of the virus. Lastly, these last two are actually probably one of the most important ways that we were able to go more quickly. The FDA, companies, physicians, government agencies all really put all of their energies and all of their best people, research scientists, manufacturing people on COVID. So imagine if you were building a house and instead of waiting 2 weeks for the permit, the guy who writes the permits was standing next to the house and gave it to you at that very moment. Imagine instead of having 5 guys working on building the construction, you had 25 working on the construction. So really a lot of this was about deploying all of our resources together to go more quickly. Currently, I wanted to answer a question or two about the issue of allergies, and we'll also talk about pregnancy because these are two of the most commonly asked questions about the vaccines. So the CDC actually recommends that people with a history of allergic reactions to things like food or pets or the environment or other allergies actually get vaccinated. In general, this is not what is causing people to have any allergic reactions to the vaccine. People with a history of allergies to certain medications or reactions to other medicines also should be able to get vaccinated. If, however, you've had a reaction in the past to a vaccine, or you have a reaction to the first dose of COVID-19 vaccine, you should not complete the series. Just a little data, because I know people are talking about one of the more severe allergic reactions people can have is what's called anaphylaxis. And you hear people talk about this if they have a peanut allergy and or other allergies, where in essence you have trouble breathing and it's an allergic reaction to a stimulant, a pet or a peanut or something like that. There have been some limited cases of what's called anaphylaxis to both the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, but they have been very rare. So as of the middle of this month, the CDC and FDA have captured about 15 cases of anaphylaxis after the Moderna vaccine and about 45 cases after the Pfizer vaccine. That means that there are about 2 cases per million doses of the Moderna vaccine and about 6 cases per million doses of the Pfizer vaccine. It's important to note that no one has died from these reactions because everyone who's giving the vaccine has been told to make sure you wait 15 to 30 minutes after you get the vaccine. You share with them if you have had reactions before, and they actually are ready with an EpiPen in case you need to be treated for an allergic reaction. So please make sure you talk with the person giving you the vaccine about any allergies you may have. The other key question we get very often is about the vaccines and pregnancy. It's important to note that until we have new additional clinical trials done, there's only limited data available on the safety of these vaccines in women who are pregnant. These studies are actually being planned and will start very soon. However, in the clinical trials I discussed, the 30,000 and 44,000 person trials, there were women who actually became pregnant during the trials. Some were in the placebo group or some were in the vaccine group. Those women are being monitored to make sure their pregnancies resolve, hopefully successfully. But in the interim, there's actually also a set of monitoring systems in place to capture information about anyone who gets pregnant around the time they get vaccinated. Because there's some risk to pregnant women of COVID-19, the CDC strongly recommends that pregnant women have a conversation with their doctor or healthcare provider about their personal risk of getting COVID-19 and make a decision with their healthcare provider about whether they should get vaccinated because their risk because of occupation or family status makes it more important to get vaccinated than not. One of the other topics that you may have been hearing about quite a bit in the press is this issue of the COVID-19 virus mutating or changing over time. And so we are all following this extremely closely because if the virus changes a great deal, it may make the vaccines less effective in preventing you from getting COVID-19. So companies and the governments and the CDC are all continuously looking at these mutations and variations in the disease, in the virus, and they're making sure that we look at how the vaccine performs in terms of protecting us against being infected by one of these changed or mutated variants of COVID-19. So what you may have heard about is the variant that's happening in the United Kingdom. They have been actively vaccinating there. And while they have found that the UK variant, which is called B117, is more transmissible, that is, it's easier to pass from person to person, they have actually also found that people vaccinated with the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, as well as I think the AstraZeneca vaccine, have still had very good responses to the vaccination and have mounted a comparable immune response and have been protected. So we're relatively confident that this first variant in the United Kingdom you will be protected against that. And you see that variants in 62 countries, including the United States. This South African variant is the one that everyone's focusing on. It's somewhat different, and everyone is looking to make sure the vaccines will protect against that particular variant as well. Moderna yesterday shared some data that they have seen a reduction in the immune response in the body against the South African variant, but they think that you still can be protected from it. But they are starting a whole new round of clinical trials to make sure that we know the protection of the vaccine against these variants. Again, one more reason to make sure we get vaccinated as soon as we have doses available, but know that everyone is making sure we check these vaccines against the virus's changes. So I just want to remind us that there are several other vaccines, as you saw on the early slide, that are being very close to their authorizations with the FDA. AstraZeneca has a 2-dose vaccine. They're finishing their enrollment in their big trial. Johnson & Johnson has a potentially 1-dose vaccine, and they're done with enrollment and just waiting for the final calculations of their efficacy. Novavax, a small Maryland-based company here near me in Washington, D.C., is currently enrolling their big trial as well. And Sanofi Pasteur has finished their phase 2 and is about to enter phase 3. So I want to pivot to talking about the systems around the vaccine and make sure that everyone's aware of how we're monitoring safety, and then we'll talk about how distribution is taking place. So the US actually has an extraordinarily robust vaccine safety system. It's comprised of a number of different government and external safety monitoring systems that collect data, that analyze whether or not a side effect we're seeing is actually a trend. And all that data goes back to the FDA and the CDC, gets folded into the prescribing information, that big, long, tiny sheet that comes with your vaccine doses, so that we are constantly updating any new side effects we see, or whether a certain side effect is occurring more frequently than we thought. And that data is continuously being fed into the decision-making of the CDC on recommendations. For COVID-19, in addition to those other systems, they added one new system that we're very excited about because it actually leverages your smartphone. So hopefully when you get vaccinated, if you haven't already, they'll suggest to you that you enroll in what's called vSafe. This is a new smartphone-based monitoring system. It allows you to text messages to say, oh, I did have a sore arm, or I had a headache for 2 days. So we can rapidly capture any information on the side effects. So it's very important if you're getting vaccinated to enroll in vSafe so that all the safety monitoring data can be gathered. And it's a very easy system. But more importantly, vSafe not only checks your actually the information on side effects, it reminds you to get your second dose. And it's very, very important to make sure we get our second dose on time, either 3 or 4 weeks from the first dose. So this system actually acts as a safety mechanism and also reminds you about your second shot. So let's talk about distribution. This table is actually on the CDC website, and you can see it at any time. It gets updated every day. So far in the US, the government has distributed over 40 million doses of vaccine, and about half of those have been given. About 3 million people have actually gotten their second dose, which is very good. And you'll see that there's a little more Pfizer vaccine than Moderna vaccine out in the system to date. It's been given. Pfizer arrived on the market about a week or 2 earlier than Moderna. But obviously our goal is to drive many more doses out so everyone can get vaccinated who wants to. So what will happen is, as you've seen, there'll be more and more doses over the next coming months, and more people will be eligible to get vaccinated. What we understand from the manufacturers is that they are on track to deliver several 100 million doses between February and the early summer. Moderna today did an announcement to say that they're on track to deliver 100 million doses by March, or the beginning of the first quarter. So we know that Pfizer is probably about the same. Both companies are averaging about 30 million doses a month for the next couple of months, and plan to definitely get to 200 million doses by summer. So over the next few months, we should see some easing of these supply constraints we're all so worried about, knowing many people want to get vaccinated. And hopefully that will make it easier to do large immunization campaigns and get to everybody who wants doses. The other vaccine companies that have contracts with the government have similar commitments of doses. So J&J is committing 100 million doses. We hope to see their product soon. AstraZeneca actually has committed 300 million doses, and Novavax another 100 million doses. So who's getting vaccinated when? Obviously, each state is doing this a little different, so certainly visit the website in your county or your state to see what phase the rollout is in. Know that these phases are actually done to try to get to people who have the highest risk of exposure or the highest risk of death. And it's kind of a combination of the two as they do the phased rollout. So obviously frontline healthcare workers were first. Many states also have been vaccinating long-term care staff and residents, very important. Many states are now in phase 1B, which is that a subset of essential workers, including those in food production, pharmaceutical production, and grocery store and corrections officers, fire, police, and of course those individuals 75 or older. Some states have actually moved to the 65 plus in order to make sure we capture those at the high risk by age and those with high risk conditions. So many states are between 1B and 1C with their doses allocated. Just a reminder of those conditions associated with severe cases of COVID-19. These are the underlying conditions where it's extremely important that people be vaccinated, and certainly while they wait to be vaccinated, that they protect themselves from exposure to COVID-19, or they could have a much worse case and hospitalization. So I just want to actually get to the end here talking about the Biden administration's COVID-19 vaccine plan. There are quite a number of things that the new administration is planning to do. You can find this in their very nice response and pandemic preparedness plan. I sourced it on the bottom. One of the things that I think will be very important is trying to give more visibility to states and counties of when they will receive new doses, giving them a visibility into the projections of deliveries from the companies so that the states and counties can better plan their mass immunization campaigns so that people can register and doses will be there. They're expanding and working closely with manufacturers to increase production. They're also prioritizing all the supplies needed both for making vaccines as well as giving vaccines so that they can be used and allocated to the COVID vaccine rollout. You heard this one early on in the Biden administration. At first, everyone was setting aside a lot of doses to guarantee the second shot for people. They're doing less of that, so more people can get the first shot. As new doses become available from the companies, those people who got a first shot will get their second injection. They're working much more with state and local governments as possible to come up with new venues for vaccination. So pharmacies will have vaccinations. There'll be clinics, the community health centers. You'll see more programs at churches and other places, mall parking lots, in order to make it easy to vaccinate people safely. You'll also see some commitment to mobile vans to get to rural areas and offer vaccines. So that goes along with reaching hard to reach populations and at-risk populations. A lot of focus on making sure that providers and governments are fairly compensated for giving the vaccine. And a lot more use of data to make sure that the vaccines are going where there's more disease to protect people. And lastly, you're going to see very soon from the Ad Council and others, a nationwide public education campaign on the vaccine. So actually, as a close, I wanted to point you to the website that we've made at Bio. It's called covidvaccinefacts.org. You'll find answers to quite a number of questions, as well as some infographics and videos that you can use if you're just looking for a nice written answer or a short video that explains the answer to a question about how vaccines are made, the pregnancy safety, the general side effects. You can go here, it acts like Bing, you can type in a question and it will share answers with you. And the questions, everything on the site is available in English and Spanish. So just a few other resources, if you're looking to see how vaccine development is going or all the other great COVID products are being developed, please go to our website to our tracker. Here in the middle, the Biodefense Coronavirus Pipeline Tracker is looking at products as they go through clinical trials and as they get approved worldwide. So we can share information with you on all the great development of both treatments and vaccines for COVID. So Lisa, that's all the slides, and I'm happy to take questions.
Great. Thank you. That was awesome, Phyllis. I really appreciate it. And we have some great questions. And I was writing them like, oh, they asked the same one I was going to ask. So let's start first, because this was one that I've had in the past. This was earlier on. So when you were talking about the clinical trials, how are people exposed to the illness to test the virus? Are they exposed by the study on purpose, or am I getting that shot and then I'm just living my life and you're seeing, am I picking it up or not? So how do they actually do that?
Great question. So this is actually, they did these trials very much the way we do trials for vaccines, which is you enroll people that you know, fortunately or unfortunately, because of their lives, are going to be in places where they're at risk of exposure to COVID. And that's why you saw a great many people enrolled who were healthcare workers, or in other essential worker jobs where they were going to be out and about living their daily lives. We do not do trials where we give people the virus. Those are called human challenge trials, and they're only done very rarely and generally only when you have a great medicine to treat someone who's been exposed. So there was some discussion in the beginning about whether challenge trials were going to need to be done. Everyone agreed that was not the right approach. And so the trials are done vaccinating people, having half the group get placebo, half the group got vaccine, and then they went about their daily lives. And you saw a lot of cases of COVID in the placebo group, even though they were all following the rules. But a lot of healthcare workers, a lot of people, unfortunately, with a lifestyle where they were going to be exposed to COVID. So you had to, and companies you had to get to at least 170 cases. So you couldn't fudge the efficacy number. The FDA was very clear that in order to file, you had to have at least 170 cases in the study at a minimum. And then you could look and see what the efficacy was in placebo versus vaccine.
There we go. And Phyllis, those are hidden. I think, I know I've had these questions. Well, the pharmaceuticals, yeah, can they manipulate? Because they're watching on this. Those are really hidden from them, right? Like
Absolutely.
Pfizer said to me, wow, you know, they don't know what's happening. Is that correct?
So what each company, that's a great question. Each company actually, when you do your clinical trials, there's always established what's called an independent data safety monitoring board. That group is a group of healthcare professionals. They are the only ones looking at the data. They see the data as it comes in, and they tell the company, you have now arrived at the number of cases where we can unblind the trial and show you the results. They are also looking at all the safety data. So if they see a safety thing that they don't like, they can tell the company, I'm sorry, we have to stop and evaluate this safety issue. Or no, this is actually within the realm of what we see normally. So for example, you know, if you think you see something related to the vaccine, but it's actually exactly the same amount as you see in the regular population, that's probably a normal side effect or a normal thing, like, you know, allergic reactions or something like that. So it's very important to note that the independent data safety monitoring board are the only people seeing the data, and they tell the company when they can see the data and not before.
Right. And, you know, what made me also feel comfortable was I know Europe also has their own FDA-like, you know, process, right? And they're looking at it at the same time the United States is looking at it, right?
Absolutely.
So that was the other comforting factor. It's not like one government can try and do something. I mean, these are independent organizations that are going through these trials and independent boards, which also made me feel good.
And the FDA and the European version of the FDA, the UK now separated from them, their own FDA, they actually talk to each other to make sure they're sharing data. Like on these variants, all the regulatory organizations are talking to each other and sharing data. But each country's regulatory agency came up with their guidelines for companies on how they wanted them to do their trials. And the FDA issued 2 specific set of guidelines to companies and told them, this is what it's going to take for me to look at your data. If you don't hit this bar, you can't even file. Right? And the same happened in Europe, Canada, other major countries as well. Similar, but not the same. So know that the same exact kinds of trials are happening all over the world with at least 10,000 to 20,000 people in each country or region.
Good. That always makes us feel better. So this was on the mRNA because this is a new technology, right? So, and that was a really helpful description of the technology in your slides. So we had a question, how will the cell continue to build these antibodies after the mRNA from the vaccine decays and therefore continue a person's immune defense?
That's a great question. And I have an answer, but I'd almost like to double check. I think that if you get exposed, if it acts like a regular vaccine, if you get exposed to COVID, your body, this is why everyone's looking at the various types of responses. Someone asked if it's neutralizing antibodies or not. It's neutralizing antibodies. So that's a good question. So if you get infected, what we should see is your body has reacted in a way that it has what we call memory, where it remembers, I've seen this before, and it literally very quickly in just a couple of days mounts that antibody response. It pulls the memory of what that looks like. It says, I've seen this COVID-19, this SARS-CoV-2 virus before, and it quickly mounts an immune response where those antibodies come out of nowhere and actually help clear the virus and keep you from getting sick, or have you have a much, much, much less severe case of COVID.
Okay, the next, so how does the monoclonal antibody infusion compare to the vaccine? So we were just talking about Regeneron. So,
this is a great question. So I think, so Regeneron actually had a press release out today. Definitely recommend you go and read it. They have been looking at their monoclonal antibody, not just to treat you when you're ill, but also potentially to give you short-term immunity before you get COVID. And so they just actually announced some preliminary data from their trials today, very exciting. You know, the monoclonal antibodies give you what's called passive immunity. They give you some antibodies that can get you over a time when you might be exposed. This is why they're great for a healthcare worker or someone who needs short-term but high protection against COVID-19. So they actually saw a very good protective response for a short period of time with the Regeneron monoclonal antibody. And actually, they also used a subcutaneous shot versus an infusion. So our hope is this will actually help for those people who need to get protection right now, but maybe either can't get the vaccine for whatever reason, or there's not enough at a certain point, or they're a healthcare worker. To get that would give you some protection for several months. The difference is vaccines teach your body to make the antibodies, and so they generally have long-term protection. So oftentimes a monoclonal antibody and a vaccine could be complementary if you need protection now, and you get the vaccine, and that gives you protection that's longer.
Great.
Sorry for the silence. I live on
the
street.
It happens. It happens. So I think this is a good question, because for a lot of us hearing about emergency use authorization, that, I don't know, it's an emergency, and so now is it going to be safe? So, you know, can you explain what emergency use authorization is and what needs to happen before these vaccines are formally approved? I mean, are we okay? Is it still safe under this emergency use? So I think if you can explain that term a little bit.
I absolutely can. So the emergency use authorization is a special tool of the FDA that's used only when you have a pandemic like this. And it literally allows them to set a bar and say, and do a risk benefit analysis. So they will look at a vaccine and they will say, at a minimum, I need to know I have this much data on safety and efficacy. And where there's, and really when you think of this EUA for this vaccine in particular, think of it as being almost all the way through to filing for a full licensure. Like literally the difference primarily is the long-term safety data. So companies could submit for an emergency use authorization. They had to finish the entire 30,000 person trial. They had to actually have over 170 cases of disease seen in that trial. So pretty significant. And they had to have at least 2 months of safety data, if not more. So companies, Moderna and Pfizer, both filed at that point. For filing of their full licensure application, they needed to be 6 months of following people after the second dose. And every company is going to extend their follow-up for their clinical trials to 2 years. So even after we get approval, hopefully this summer, the people in the clinical trials will be followed closely for another 18 months for safety. That we never stop following people for safety in the clinical trials. And in addition, we'll have all the safety data gathered from the use of the product under the authorization. Does that help?
Yeah, so, but when you say safety data, is it also, as you're continuing to monitor these people in the clinical trials, are you looking at, okay, 6 months has gone by and whoa, it looks like maybe some are picking up COVID, or no, 12, I mean, we're not at 12 months, I don't think quite yet. So, but is that also being monitored of the ones that actually, that we know didn't get the placebo, got the real thing, that we're watching to see the efficacy is actually going down after a certain amount of time, and that's when we're going to need boosters again? Is that happening?
Those are, so that's, yes. And so safety data to me is about redness, any extra side effects that we didn't see before. What you're talking about is actually is monitoring vaccine effectiveness, absolutely a core part of what's done as well. So you'll look at so in the case of Moderna and Pfizer, because it would be unethical once you had a highly efficacious vaccine not to give it, the placebo groups are getting vaccinated, right? So you're going to have everyone who was in the trials will have received the vaccine over the next couple of months, but everyone will be followed for side effects. And in addition, we will also follow people to make sure that no one will, we call breaks through from vaccination. So if they had a good immune response and then 7-8 months later they get COVID, that's a breakthrough. And so we always look at that to look at the real world effectiveness of the vaccine outside of the clinical trial process. So yes, both of those things will be monitored over that 2-year period.
Great. So here's another question on the vaccines. If we get one of the current Moderna or the Pfizer vaccine, but then now Johnson & Johnson comes out and then, wow, that looks like it's really great. And maybe it's even more effective, although these have been sitting at 95%, pretty high. Should I also get the J&J one? So right now it sounds like if I get the first Pfizer, I definitely need to get the second Pfizer. They're not giving Moderna, right?
There's no data. So the UK is doing that, but here the FDA has strongly said they would like people to complete the series with the vaccine that they started with. And I think that will be true no matter how many vaccines are on the market. Generally, they're going to want people to start and finish with the same one, because there will no clinical trial included switching, or what we call interchangeability, right? At some point, companies will probably do that, but probably not mixing technologies. So it could be that someone will look at Moderna and Pfizer, start with one, finish with one, et cetera. But it will be interesting to see whether anyone looks at starting with mRNA and ending with adenovector, right? Which is what the J&J vaccine is. So these would be the studies that would be done later. In the beginning, I think in order to be efficient, they will recommend that people start and end with the same vaccine.
Yeah, and as I recall, there was a question then, when you put up those numbers, how much, the 100 million of the vaccines coming in from Pfizer and Moderna, Johnson & Johnson had a certain number. Was that for the United States only?
Those were the
correct?
US contracts only. So
okay, so then do they have their own manufacturing elsewhere in the world happening to supply that?
So companies have actually this is one of the things I'm really proud of, the way the companies did this work. The companies actually strategically have worked to have manufacturing partners or their own facilities in regions all around the world, because they know we need to get to 2 to 4 billion doses in the next year or two. And that means that everyone has had to partner with other manufacturing sites in order to be closer to where those doses need to go. So for example, AstraZeneca has a partnership with Serum Institutes of India, which is a fantastic developing country vaccine manufacturer. They also are partnering Serum with Novavax. So Serum will actually produce both of those vaccines, particularly for low and middle income countries. Johnson & Johnson has multiple sites worldwide. Pfizer has multiple sites worldwide. So many of the companies have entered into partnerships to make sure they have a production site in Asia, one in Europe, Canada, US, Latin America, so that doses can be available everywhere.
So I probably should have asked this before I went into those numbers. So let's say I get COVID, and then I think they wait for a few months, and
that's correct.
right? But then I get vaccinated. So if I get vaccinated or have COVID, can I still, get it? I mean, I know that's what they're kind of watching with through those clinical studies that we had just mentioned.
Right.
But do you think, have we seen much? I heard some things earlier, several months ago, where they were saying someone that had COVID, it seemed that they got COVID again. And that was before the vaccines.
Right,
Are you hearing any more of that, or what's the status of that?
So when they look at people who actually got natural infection with COVID, it does depend on how severe your case was. So what they're seeing is the people that had it again, sometimes generally had a relatively milder case the first time, but they are definitely trying to understand why people are having multiple incidences of COVID-19, why to some degree natural immunity is not enduring in people. So we have to look at the same thing within the vaccines, of course, right? Will this be like flu, where you need it every year? Will this be like pneumococcal, where you need a 5-year boost? So these are the things we'll have to learn. The immune response of the vaccines is considerably higher than natural infection. So that's good. Hopefully that endures as protection, and hopefully people are making the right antibody response in their cells that allows you to mount an immune response quickly if you get exposed naturally. But these are the things we're going to have to look for over the next coming years.
So another thing, and I know I was saying incorrect information. I was thinking, okay, once I get this vaccine, if I am around someone with COVID, I won't, not only will I not get it, I'm not going to transmit it, right? I'm going to stop it in its tracks once it gets into my body. And I was wrong. And then I know they're still wondering too. I mean, it's not for sure 100% that you aren't going to stop it, but it sounds like, you could still have it in your mucus, in your mouth. Exactly. I could sneeze. I could still transmit it even though I've had the vaccine. And so could you talk a little bit about that, and how are they going to study that? How do you study something like that?
Transmissibility. I know
yes.
It's really not easy. So they are definitely trying to study. Actually, the Moderna data in their phase 3 trial was an early indicator. They actually looked at whether they prevented asymptomatic infections. So which is sort of the step right before to look. If you could keep people from getting an infection where they didn't have any symptoms, could you also therefore be helping them not to, if you could keep them from getting any symptoms at all or no symptoms, then hopefully you could interrupt their ability to give it to someone else, right? But we still need to look specifically at transmissibility. So you're going to have to look and see whether you vaccinate people and whether they shed or spit, any COVID particles. But in the interim, the key thing is until we get a high vaccination rate, since we don't know if we're stopping people from giving it one to another, best to wear masks until you're in a room with generally mostly people who are vaccinated. And then it won't matter as much whether someone comes in the room and sneezes and you're not wearing a mask if most of the people in that room are protected from getting a severe or even any infection with COVID. So it's true, we're going to have to do the mask thing for a while until we reach that high number of vaccinated persons. And in the meantime, we will look and see if you can actually keep people from carrying, we call that carriage, carrying the vaccine in the nose or the back of the throat, or places where if you were to have droplets, you would infect someone else.
But aren't they seeing that it doesn't seem like it's on the surfaces quite as much? Early on, it was like, oh my God, I have to clean everything. And aren't they finding that it's more from transmitting from the nose and the mouth, right? Absolutely. Much more than on the surfaces?
Yeah, I think that it's great to keep everything clean, right? But it is definitely much more about the transmission of the nose and mouth than it is about hand contact with various different, doorknobs and so on. But I think that it's still important for us to watch those things. And that's why the hand washing is so pivotal, because if everyone washes their hands frequently, then the doorknob issue is less of a problem.
Right.
If we don't, then it's not. But it's definitely much more about the person-to-person contact of droplets.
So let's go on though. Say there was a question by someone, is the vaccine safe for people living with autoimmune diseases?
So this is a really good question. So there were some people with some autoimmune diseases. There were people with sickle cell in the trials and a few other autoimmune diseases. In general, the recommendation is that you should talk with your healthcare provider about your specific autoimmune disorder. I will say that I know some people who have MS and some other underlying autoimmune disorders who got vaccinated and have had a good experience, but those people all talked with their physician beforehand. It was good to have both. There were people with stable HIV infection and people with, again, sickle cell and a few other diseases. So there were some, but I think it's so good to have that discussion.
Okay. Going back to the mRNA again, so can you explain again the difference between mRNA vaccines, which are the Pfizer and Moderna, and the others expected to be given approval soon? So, you know, like Johnson & Johnson, so now theirs, isn't it ambient temperature? Do they even have, maybe it's refrigeration?
It's refrigerated. All of the vaccines, they will have actually, when they come, AstraZeneca and Johnson & Johnson are the same technology. And when they come, they will be refrigerator stable, and actually we'll probably have some data on room temperature as well as refrigerator temperature. So those two vaccines actually use what's called an adenovirus platform. You take a relatively harmless adenovirus. Adenovirus causes colds in some people. And actually you take that virus and you actually change one of the parts of the genome of the virus, and you put the coronavirus spike protein there. And your body actually reacts to the coronavirus on the adeno. So think of the adenovirus vector as what I jokingly call the suitcase, right? It's literally meant to deliver the coronavirus instructions to the body. And it's going to actually have your body mount a reaction to the coronavirus specific genes that have been put on top of the adenovirus. Your body's not going to necessarily react to the adenovirus itself. It's going to really make an immune reaction to coronavirus specifically. It's a very neat technology, and it can be used for multiple different things. So that particular vaccine, those two, use different kinds of adenoviruses and are specifically meant to elicit an immune response and can be used for different things. So for example, the J&J adenovirus vector was used to make a very good Ebola virus vaccine. So instead of putting COVID on the adenovirus, they put Ebola on there, and your body reacts and makes an immune response to Ebola. This is being used in West Africa right now to help prevent outbreaks there. So there's a licensed vaccine using the J&J technology. For Novavax and other vaccines behind there, they're actually using a different technology. They're literally, it's more similar to the human papillomavirus vaccine, how that's made. They're literally making the computer make a version of the coronavirus that has no DNA inside. So your body gets an injection of something that mimics the coronavirus outer shell with the spike proteins, which is where the antibodies react, but you don't actually have any coronavirus inside. That's how the human papillomavirus works, as vaccine works as well. You're getting a DNA-free, like literally hollowed out version of the virus, and your body mounts an immune response to that.
So Phyllis, what you're also saying when you bring up these technologies, this has happened with whether it's in drug discovery or drug delivery, I should say, or vaccines, that when we've received it for other conditions or other vaccines, there's always been different technology platforms, Absolutely. Right? And this is common that we are seeing pharmaceuticals utilize different types of platforms. Is that correct?
Absolutely. And I think what's really interesting about these three platforms we're discussing is they have in common the fact that you don't need to grow the virus itself. You actually can use, literally, you literally download, it's like fairy dust to me, it's sort of magic. You literally download the genetic sequence in all, itself, and you feed it into a computer, and the computer actually makes something that looks like the virus, or it literally makes the mRNA sequence happen within the technology itself. So you're not having to, like we currently do with flu vaccine or like we do with measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine, grow the actual virus, either kill it like you do for flu, or what we call attenuate it, stretch it a little bit for measles so it's not as infectious. So those technologies are older. They are tried and true. I mean, we're talking billions of doses of flu and billions of doses of measles, mumps, rubella. But those technologies take longer because you have to wait for the virus to grow, do what you need to do to it, then purify, then fill it into vials. For these technologies, you do all the work on the computer, you then have your vaccine candidate. You don't have to wait for the virus itself to grow and do anything. So a lot of the new technologies you're going to see for vaccines skip that step of viral growth and actually do more, use more of the digital information for these viruses. This will allow you to go from one disease to the other relatively simply. So the mRNA vaccines are being looked at for flu, being looked at for cytomegalovirus. They can go from one disease to another relatively simply.
Great, thank you. So let's talk about the distribution a little bit. Here's a question.
Sure.
So I mean, that's an emotional issue for a lot of us, because this is one time in my life I wish I was over 65. I mean, so
This too shall pass.
I know. So is the CDC, here's a question, is the CDC capturing best practice for vaccine distribution experiences?
Actually, that's a great question. And yes, they are. And they're really trying to share that. So the CDC and actually those, the big national associations that support public health. So the Association of Immunization Managers representing all the jurisdictions, the Association of State and Territorial Health Officers, ASTHO, and NATO. These organizations are all sharing best practices with each of the state's public health and health leaders. And the National Governors Association is also sharing best practices between the governors. So I think they are trying to learn from each other. Some states have done better than others, as we all know. Each state is taking a different approach, as we all know, but I think they're starting to learn what is working, particularly in setting up larger immunization sites. So, Massachusetts has told people, get on, register. They're going to be doing programs in Gillette Field, in Fenway, and I think one of the things all the states are hopefully going to do better now that they've got infusion of resources in December in the last congressional appropriation, they actually can start hiring. So hopefully those of you who are physicians or nurses or pharmacists have been contacted to maybe volunteer to give the vaccine at one of the mass immunization sites as well.
Great. Okay, so back to the vaccine itself. There's so much to this. There's more the correct.
The kid question. I assume that was one. So
yeah, there's a kid question too. Yeah, is the coronavirus going to be eradicated if the population gets vaccinated, or will it persist in the US or really globally indefinitely?
That's a really good question. I think we're all a little thrown by the rapidity of the mutations. Coronaviruses historically have been very slow evolving viruses that don't change that much. Not like flu that, as you all know, changes every year. We have to make a vaccine every year. So I think that everyone's trying to understand this variant issue and what that means for the durability of the coronaviruses worldwide. To some degree, we're all finding that it's because it's infecting all of us that we're little variant machines, where to some degree it's about the fact that it's infecting so many people that it's having the chance to mutate so much. So can we nip that in the bud by our global vaccination program? If yes, maybe we can slow what happens with the coronaviruses. But I think time will tell here. We're a long way from having 75 to 80% uptake of vaccine. So in the meantime, while the virus has a host, it will continue to vary and mutate ever so slightly over time.
So go ahead. So then let's do the children. So yeah, for all the parents out there, can children, and where do you see that time frame? I mean,
actually, my understanding that the clinical trials in kids are actually underway. So there's been, everyone knows we want to get kids back to school. This is why teachers are in 1B, right? So everyone put teachers in one of the early groups for vaccination, hoping that would help us get kids back in actual real school. Protect the teachers first. They're more at risk of actual severe illness than children. And then very quickly have the data for kids immunization. So both Pfizer and Moderna are doing trials. They started in the next level down adolescents. So Pfizer was already had some data in 12 to 16-year-olds. So they had already started in their 44,000 person trial. So they have a little bit of data in adolescents, but they're doing a much bigger trial now. Moderna the same. So the goal will be to get down in age kind of in chunks into young adolescents and then down into pediatric after that, knowing that the illness, you see more illness as you go up in age, so kind of going backwards. So I think that we may see some data and maybe some additional vaccine approvals or authorizations for younger ages late spring, early summer, because they are enrolling. And they're really looking to make sure that children get the same immune response as adults. They're not going to do the same waiting for cases. So it doesn't take as long, right? They want to make sure that if a 14-year-old has the same kind of neutralizing antibody response as an adult. So it's called bridging. So we bridge down in age and bridge down in age. So this is important and it needs to be done as soon as we possibly can.
And they will even have in those clinical trials children with underlying conditions?
Yeah, I think the goal is, because we're in a pandemic, everyone's paying much more attention to having the trials look more like the population.
Right.
And I think now that they've had it worked out with the FDA ways to enroll people with underlying conditions, they will try to keep doing that.
Okay, sounds good. Let me see. What other ones can I can do? So the vaccines, another one. Yeah. So the vaccines are free, right? But who ultimately is paying for them if they're free?
I mean, the taxpayers are paying for them. I think let's be completely honest. So all 6 of the companies that have contracts with Operation Warp Speed, were those contracts covered the development and the manufacturing and the purchase of the vaccines. The companies also put in money, so that the Operation Warp Speed money doesn't cover the entire cost of development and manufacturing, but it does include some investments in those things, particularly manufacturing, which had to be really stepped up to make hundreds of millions of doses in a very short time. So most of what you're seeing in that $11 billion spent by the federal government on these 6 vaccines is purchase. And so these are definitely, it's an emergency, a national health emergency. So the government really has been driving the process with companies, but they've let the companies drive the science. And so the companies and the FDA have worked out the scientific details, doing the studies according to the guidelines from FDA. And then they've been very instrumental in helping companies get the manufacturing up and going.
So we touched on this a little bit with Europe manufacturing, that there are manufacturing elsewhere, India. But the one thing, and again, I spoke selfishly, hey, I can't wait till I get my vaccine. But do you feel that just globally and then our pharmaceuticals are looking to make sure we are getting these vaccines into Africa, Central America, places, the poorer countries?
Absolutely.
Obviously, United States, wealthy country, government pays for it. Here's our distribution plan. Right. Do you think there's enough international effort on this pandemic, especially where they just said South Africa? We're really concerned about that variant. So if anything, it's going to help all of us to make sure we are getting this to countries that maybe there would be some strange mutations that could come out. I mean, what's your feeling so far about getting these vaccines to play, even though I know how difficult it is with the Pfizer vaccine? So maybe it's more waiting for, is it more the AstraZeneca or Johnson & Johnson? So if you could just touch on, do you feel that we are addressing the poorer countries with the vaccine?
Actually, industry has been, along with many governments, strongly supportive of a global initiative called COVAX. This has been stood up with Gavi, which is the very important non-governmental organization that generally buys vaccine for the 75 poorest countries in the world. All of the vaccine manufacturers, including the Western ones and the ones in developing countries, all make and sell vaccines to Gavi for poor countries. So we already had a mechanism in some degree to help pull everyone together to buy doses for the poorest countries in the world. So this has been set up. Companies have submitted their prices and their dose projections to UNICEF. Probably many people know UNICEF under the UN. UNICEF is buying the doses on behalf of Gavi. It's very convoluted, all these things globally. But in the end, the cornerstone issue is doses are being allocated and acquired for the 90 poorest countries in the world. That includes Africa, Latin America, and Asia Pacific countries. And those doses are being funded with funds from Western countries, as well as other government organizations or non-government organizations like the Gates Foundation. So they've raised over $2 billion, and now they will start to buy doses from the various companies. And there's some countries that may be able to have the Pfizer vaccine in controlled settings, for like in a hospital, for example. And so all of the companies have put in their bids and are offering up their vaccines as they have them to COVAX to make sure everyone gets doses.
That's great. That makes me feel better because
Yes,
when I put my
important.
selfishness to the side.
It's a global pandemic. I mean, if we're going to start
Right.
traveling and doing what we want to do, we've got to make sure that you can go anywhere and know that people are vaccinated and protected. So we really do have to have a global approach to this.
So I had read somebody's comment in a paper that felt that if they eat well, exercise, they hydrate, I'm not worried. I'm not going to get sick. Why do I need the vaccine? Was there anything in those clinical studies? And I know they did have people that were very healthy and those that had some conditions, but were they seeing anything that was that different because someone supposedly was really I didn't know if there was anything that they really kind of pulled that out or.
They really never look for that. It's very fascinating because they only ever tell you that it performs well in people who you expect it wouldn't perform well in, right? And so I think having such a high efficacy number and not really a lot of difference for people who had diabetes or obesity, which are normally kind of immune compromising conditions, means that it really just it really is a very effective vaccine, regardless of what might be your particular underlying health issues, whether you're in beautiful, perfect health or not. The vaccine actually confers a really strong immune response. I think that's good. We were so much more worried about performance in people who were older or sick. I don't think we even looked at whether anybody healthy had any problems or not.
Right. So another thing that I had heard, you have people, this did originate out of China, but this has happened. We've had different diseases come out of different locations throughout the world. This has always happened and it's going to continue to happen. But one of the things that I heard that gave me a lot of hope on this particular pandemic was the international cooperation that happened immediately from China, Europe, the United States, researchers from all over the world sharing data, pharmaceuticals sharing data with one another. Can you talk about that? Because wasn't it the genome was sequenced like in 10 days or 2 weeks? Yes. But that was because China, Asian, they were all sharing, right? This was nobody's trying to stop anything. It's like, we got to fight this together. Could you just talk a little bit about that? Because that's where we are today with vaccines. That was another reason we are where we are today, correct? Definitely.
I think that having systems in place, I think we learned our lesson from some of the more severe flus that, avian flu, where it took a long time to get people to share the virus samples and the sequencing. We had the same problem with Zika, where companies were trying to get access to the samples and it was taking a long time to get those. And so you really couldn't, you were trying to make sure that if you saw something in California that you knew whether it came from that country or it was different. So I think in this case, everyone was actually very pleased with how quickly the sequence information and samples started being available through the WHO and through the CDC, because the CDC is actually a global part of all these different systems to gather virus samples on different viruses. And I think as importantly, very quickly, the world started using a particular system, several systems that were used for flu, to start having a place to put the samples so that everyone was putting them into the same location. And also sequencing the virus. So that data, the digital data was there too, so that everyone could go in and quickly look. So if you needed to see if there was a variant or if you needed to see what you were looking at, you could get into this one public system, register in there, and know that you had the latest data from which countries, from different countries.
And it seems like that's even what's happening now with, we're seeing these mutations, people,
Absolutely.
they're communicating instantly to really be tracking.
Because you actually had several systems that existed for influenza and were being used as well for respiratory syncytial virus, another respiratory virus, you could actually very quickly, everyone moved to use that same system for the new respiratory virus, in essence, corona. So people knew where to go. People were used to putting samples into that system, and they were used to putting digital information into that system. And I think that's a very important history of collaboration that's actually now going more smoothly and more rapidly because of corona.
That's great. And I know we have more time, but it starts to get pretty long, I know, for people, and Zoom people can only last so long, and you've answered so many questions.
Absolutely.
Like, see, things keep popping in my head. Just any final comments that you want to make about trusting this? I mean, again, we keep hearing about trust. Can I trust it? Can I trust it? And, you know, just because I do, I trust it, I know it, I really feel comfortable. Certainly this is why we had this. We want to build people's trust and confidence in the system that, you know, it's not being controlled just by a pharmaceutical or a government entity. I mean, this is a global response to something that's, you know, obviously impacted our lives greatly. Is there any other final comments you want to make concerning trust and that the scientific data is not just controlled by some pharmaceuticals or just by our government? I mean, this is really open, and we're not trying to hide anything. So there's just maybe something on the trust factor about this vaccine.
Absolutely. I think what's really important are a couple of things. One, please know that people can actually go read all the data for themselves. So depending on your tolerance for, you know, regulatory blah blah gobbledygook, you can actually go to the FDA website and download all the documents that were used for evaluation of vaccines. You can see how the trials were done. All of the companies have publicly put up their protocol, meaning how they did their trial. You can see what they measured, how long, and that's relatively unusual. Normally the protocols are kept hidden, but the companies wanted to make sure people could see everything. So this is how we're going to do the study. And then the FDA documents show everything about what data you saw. In addition, the CDC has many different explanations up so people can take a look, and they reference everything back to both publications and the FDA. So everyone's trying to be completely transparent. You can go to any of the meetings. So when Johnson & Johnson, for example, submits for their emergency use authorization, there will be a public meeting with independent thought leaders who reviewed that data, and they will have a one-day discussion. You can listen to that, you can make comments. And the same is true for the CDC. When they have a recommendations meeting, you can go to that meeting, you can submit your name to make comments or send written comments. So the interaction of the public is pivotal, and we want people to see all the data. Companies are putting on their websites how they're doing with enrollment for diversity. So I especially want to say to people who may be in racial and ethnic groups who are wondering, will I see myself in this data? Understand that companies are trying to make sure that they have a high number of participants who are Black, Latino, or Latinx, who come from different racial and ethnic groups, and they're breaking down the data by groups so you can see that people like you were involved in the trials and the data is the same or it's not the same, whatever that answer is. So I think that people should engage with their healthcare provider, have the discussions, get any information you need, and just keep asking questions. It's perfectly legitimate to ask questions. It's really important to ask questions and make sure that you get the data you need to make a good decision. And I hope it's for vaccination, but I think it's really about real information from a good, trusted source.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Phyllis. This was awesome. And by the comments, this was really great. And I'm really looking forward to, you know, everybody feeling confident that they can get the vaccines, and that when their time comes to get out there and get them. And looks like there's some good plans coming out of the Biden administration. And the manufacturers are gearing up, and
they are churning, you know.
This is great.
Many people working overtime, three rounds, making as much vaccine as possible, get it out the door. So.
Yep, and for the people still remaining, just so you know, we have companies in Wisconsin that have been part of the testing, manufacturing of the vaccines and the therapeutics. I mean, we should all be proud of a lot of our engagement from our industry here in Wisconsin. It's awesome. And our researchers as well that we were talking about, the international cooperation. We had many researchers in our research institutions participating in that data exchange. So, yeah,
well,
so got to be proud of Wisconsin.
You have a lot of great institutions there, so I'm not surprised.
Exactly. So thank you again, Phyllis, and please stay well, and hopefully get vaccine soon. And
yes, I'm going to get myself. My parents get it this Saturday. I'm very excited. They're over 75,
yay.
So I made sure they got in line in front of me. So then I'm going to get mine next.
All right.
Thank you very much,
awesome.
Lisa.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for attending. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. Bye-bye.
Bye.